59 years ago, a small island with no natural resources, no fresh water of its own, and an income level lower than many of its poorer neighbors, was kicked out of a union it never wanted to leave. Its founding leader cried on national television, not knowing if his country would even survive its first year. Today, that same island has one of the highest average incomes on the planet, outranking the United Kingdom, outranking Japan, outranking almost every nation that used to look down on it. This is Singapore. And its story isn't really about luck. It's about a set of decisions, so ruthless, so unconventional, that most countries never dared to try them, and the ones that did rarely followed through. So here's the real question. Dozens of former colonies gained independence around the same time as Singapore. Nearly all of them had more land, more people, more natural wealth. Almost none of them ended up rich. What did this one tiny island do differently? And more importantly, could any other country actually copy it? Or did Singapore get away with something that only works once? To understand how strange Singapore's rise really is, you have to understand how it started. In August 1965, Singapore didn't choose independence. It was expelled from Malaysia, its much larger neighbor. After 2 years of political and ethnic tension that many feared would explode into violence, Singapore had almost no farmland, no oil, no coal, not even enough fresh water to supply its own population. It had to import water through pipelines from Malaysia, the very country that had just cut it loose. Unemployment was high, housing was worse. Hundreds of thousands of people lived crammed into slums and squatter settlements with no plumbing, no reliable electricity, and constant fire risk. The population was a patchwork of ethnic Chinese, Malay, and Indian communities, who had rioted against each other just a year earlier, leaving dozens dead in the streets. Foreign observers at the time didn't predict Singapore's rise. Many predicted its collapse. Lee Kuan Yew, the man who would lead the country for the next 3 decades, later admitted that, when independence was announced, he did not feel triumphant. He felt fear. Here was a nation smaller than most cities, surrounded by larger neighbors, with a population that didn't yet think of itself as one people, and an economy that had just lost its biggest trading partner overnight, by almost any measure available in 1965. Singapore should not have worked. So what did Lee Kuan Yew's government actually do? This is where the story gets interesting, because the answer isn't a single genius policy. It's a series of hard, often unpopular choices, made one after another, and rarely reversed. The first move was about survival, not growth. With no natural resources to sell and no domestic market big enough to matter, Singapore's leaders made a decision that seems obvious now but was genuinely radical at the time. Instead of trying to protect local industries from foreign competition, Singapore threw its doors wide open to foreign companies. It built industrial estates specifically designed to attract international manufacturers. It offered tax incentives, built the infrastructure those companies needed, and trained workers to meet their standards. Rather than waiting for local companies to grow into that role on their own timeline, this wasn't just a policy on paper. Government officials personally flew to the United States, Europe, and Japan to pitch multinational corporations directly, promising political stability, a disciplined workforce, and a location perfectly placed along the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Multinational companies started arriving to build electronics and textiles factories. It was unglamorous, low-margin work at first, but it put people to work, and it built the industrial habits Singapore would need later. While factories were rising, something else was happening that mattered just as much. The government tackled housing as if it were a national emergency. Because it was, a new agency began constructing high-rise public housing at a pace almost unheard of anywhere in the world. And within roughly a decade, the majority of Singapore's population had moved from slums into modern apartments. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. A population with stable housing, in a country designed to mix ethnic communities within the same buildings, rather than letting them cluster into separate enclaves, is a population less likely to riot, less likely to be swayed by instability, and more available for consistent, disciplined labor. Here's where most retellings of Singapore's story stop at the factories and the apartment blocks. But the real turning point, the decision that shaped everything that came after, was less visible and far more controversial. Singapore's government decided, deliberately and urged, that corruption would not be tolerated at any level, and it backed that decision with real enforcement, not just speeches. An anti-corruption agency was given sweeping investigative powers, answerable directly to the highest levels of government. And it went after ministers and top officials just as aggressively as it went after ordinary citizens. In a region where bribery was often treated as simply the cost of doing business, this was close to unthinkable, but it sent an unmistakable signal to the multinational companies. Singapore was quoting, "Your investment here will be protected by predictable rules, not eaten alive by backroom deals." At the same time, the government paid its own civil servants and ministers extremely high salaries, arguing openly that underpaid officials were officials who would eventually be tempted to take bribes. Critics called it excessive. Supporters called it the price of an honest government. Either way, it reduced one of the biggest reasons that foreign investment avoids developing countries: the fear that money will simply be stolen along the way. This is the turning point worth sitting with, because it explains so much of what followed. Singapore didn't just build factories and apartments. It built trust, the kind of trust that makes an American electronics company or a European bank willing to put real money into a tiny, resource-poor island instead of a larger, richer-looking neighbor. That trust compounded. Once a handful of multinational companies proved that Singapore was stable, predictable, and efficient, more followed. The government kept reinvesting, pushing the economy up the value chain from simple manufacturing into electronics, then into oil refining and shipping services, and eventually into banking and finance. By the 1990s, Singapore wasn't just making things for other countries anymore. It was becoming one of the financial centers those countries relied on. The consequences of these choices are almost hard to believe. In 1965, Singapore's average income per person was roughly on par with countries like Jordan, a modest, developing world figure. Today, its average income per person is among the highest in the world, well above the United Kingdom's, and by some measures, above the United States. A country that once had to import fresh water through pipes from a neighbor that had just rejected it, now runs one of the busiest, most technologically advanced ports on the planet, and manages a financial sector that global banks treat as one of Asia's most important hubs. The human impact was just as dramatic. Life expectancy climbed from the mid-60s into the top tier globally. Infant mortality, once a serious public health problem, dropped 2 levels, rivaling the world's wealthiest nations. Literacy became nearly universal. The slums that once defined the island largely disappeared, replaced by planned public housing that today houses the vast majority of citizens. A housing success story that many wealthier nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, still struggle to match with their own affordable housing efforts. But the story isn't a simple fairy tale, and it's worth being honest about what this transformation cost. Singapore's political system remained tightly controlled for decades, with limited space for open political opposition and press freedom significantly restricted. Critics argued that Singapore's economic miracle was built alongside a trade-off: extraordinary material progress in exchange for reduced civil liberties. Supporters countered that the stability this system provided was exactly what allowed the economic transformation to happen at all, without the political chaos that derailed so many other developing nations during the same decades. Historians and economists still debate how much of Singapore's success depended on this authoritarian discipline. That debate has never been fully settled. There's also the matter of inequality, an issue Singapore itself openly acknowledges today. Even as average income soared, the gap widened considerably. Government data shows wealth concentrated among a small percentage, even as the country invested heavily in housing, healthcare, and education. Singapore's leaders have spent recent years actively trying to address this gap, adjusting taxes and social spending, aware that a population that feels left behind is a threat to the very stability the country was built on. So where does that leave Singapore today? The island that once had nothing to sell, but its location now sells expertise, capital, and trust itself. It's a global banking hub, a major oil refining center, and home to one of the world's busiest ports, all packed onto land smaller than New York City. Its sovereign wealth funds now hold investments scattered across the globe, turning a country that once desperately needed foreign capital into an exporter of its own. Multinational corporations that once had to be personally recruited by government officials now compete for a presence there. And yet, Singapore's government still talks about vulnerability, not comfort. Officials regularly remind citizens that the country has no natural resources, sits on contested global shipping routes, and remains dependent on trade and stability in a world that is becoming less predictable, not more. That mindset, Permanent vigilance, instead of permanent confidence, may be one of the most underrated reasons. Singapore has never repeated the kind of complacency that has stalled other fast-growing economies after their initial boom. Here's what makes Singapore's story genuinely difficult to copy, even for governments that admire it. It wasn't one clever policy. It was dozens of unpopular, disciplined decisions, sustained without reversal for decades. By a government willing to trade certain freedoms for stability, and willing to enforce rules against its own officials as strictly as against anyone else. Very few nations have that combination of political will and follow-through. Many countries have tried to build their own version of Singapore's economic model. Almost none have matched the results, because the hardest part was never the economic strategy. It was the discipline to actually stick with it. So the question worth asking isn't just how Singapore got rich. It's this: if the price of that kind of transformation, if years of restricted political freedom and total, unwavering discipline from the very top, how many nations and how many citizens would actually be willing to pay it?